Geography. The podcast.
What if?
What if? To Yoda eyes.
I was thinking that,
podcast.
that's how Yoda would say it.
I'm quickly running out of ways to introduce, to like say the same thing over and over again as we start a new podcast episode. I feel like
you have to get creative.
I'm gonna have to get creative, right? Which maybe this was the very first start of me being creative, and it wasn't that creative. I just I just mixed up the name.
Just change syntax a little bit.
Yeah. So, hi everyone. Welcome to the What If Geography podcast. We are recording, just double checking. This is the podcast where we, as usual, we dredge up all kinds of what if solutions around specific topics and talk about them and
give you some background and then start wildly speculating.
And this is going to be a wild one, I think. So before we get into today's topic, let's do a little bit of introduction. So my name's Jeff Gibson. I host a YouTube channel called What If Geography. So youtube.com/whatifgeography. That covers broadly the same topics, same idea, certainly, but condensed into 8 to 12 minutes episodes. And that's been very fun. But now we are doing this podcast where this is now episode. We sort of jumbled our episodes here.
That's right.
So I think this one will be episode like 7 or 8.
Something like that.
Yeah. So as you're listening to this, it probably comes as no surprise, but we don't record these the day of that we publish them. So some of them we recorded well in advance. So,
and this is one of those.
This is one of those. We will do. So I guess if you want to follow me outside of this podcast, you can at my Substack newsletter, geographybyjeff.substack.com. I'll just post different bits of geography stuff, maps, more of my writings, and maybe some side audio stuff. But I'm going to turn it over to my co-host to introduce himself.
Hello, my name is Hunter Shobe. I'm a professor of geography at Portland State University. If you want to check out some of my work, there's a couple books that I've co-authored. They're cultural atlases. The first is called Portlandness, a cultural atlas. And the second is Upper Left Cities, a cultural atlas of San Francisco, Portland, and Seattle. And if you're interested in those cities, check it out. If you're interested in places and cities in general, check it out because it gives you a different way of looking at things. And Jeff is a contributor to Upper Left Cities as well.
Yeah. I mean, they're really fun books. Yeah. If you like atlases in general, I think you're going to like these books. If you like graphics and maps in general, I think you're going to like these. So
if you are listening to this podcast, you're
probably going to like that.
You might be into it.
Yeah. Yeah, I would imagine the Venn diagram of people who listen to this podcast and people who like books like that are probably
pretty strong overlap.
Strong circle features there.
I suspect so.
Yeah. So, So welcome to the podcast. We are we're very excited to be back with you today. And let's kind of dive into our topic, which is, and I'll explain the reasoning why these two places in a second. But the topic is, what if the United States and Europe were primarily powered by nuclear energy today? And the reason why, and I have a question for you, Hunter, in just a second, but the reason why these two countries, or these two regions specifically, Europe isn't a country, is because of a confluence of things. One, Hunter and I are based here in the U.S., and the U.S. has a strong history, which we'll dive into, around nuclear energy and nuclear everything.
Stronger than you might think.
And that was the original episode of the same name, or very similar name, that I published back in early summer, which was, or maybe even spring, which was, what if the United States was powered entirely by nuclear energy? And then the reason why I'm bringing Europe into the mix is because of the current European energy crisis that is hitting the continent right now, and sort of how that came to be. And I think there's a lot of nuclear energy plays a lot into sort of what's happening there, because there's an alternate history that Europe could look and feel very different today in terms of the energy crisis.
Well, and to talk about nuclear energy is to talk about other ways of creating energy as well. So that's part of this. And,
right.
And this is a particularly severe situation. But Europe annually has a crisis based on energy, and it's sort of reached ahead, of course, with what's happening. But we'll be able to dip into some of that as well.
Right. So I think before we get into the history, which is what we normally start with, Hunter, I'm just going to throw this question at you because I think, I'm just going to throw this question at you. What do you know of nuclear energy?
What I know from nuclear energy, I've learned entirely from The Simpsons. No, that's not. That's not the. If that were true, it would be a pretty grim assessment, I think.
But I think that goes to show that a lot of people will probably have a certain perspective on nuclear energy that is derived from The Simpsons, which is easily one of the most popular global television shows,
it's
television shows in the world, right?
It's certainly one of the longest running. I think it's the longest running situation comedy in history. And it speaks to the way that nuclear energy has been portrayed in popular culture.
Right.
And it's generally a pretty negative assessment, I think it's fair to say. And so, I mean, certainly there's some caveats and some things to be careful of, but I think, we'll have an opportunity to look a little bit more critically, and some of the things that we'll discuss maybe a little bit surprising to a lot of people. And so, as I was doing some research to this, and I haven't researched this in the way that you have as extensively, but I found it pretty challenging in a lot of ways to research as well, because pretty quickly you start getting into some scientific explanations of things that, I don't have a whole lot of expertise in. So I stand to learn a lot, not only from the research we've done, but from having this discussion as well.
Yeah. And I think to that point, I won't be delving too much into the science. We're going to talk a little bit about it, but I'm also not a scientist. I'm definitely not a nuclear scientist. There's a lot that escapes me as well, right? I think if nothing else, nuclear is a complicated and very sophisticated technology and we'll talk about a lot of what goes into it, but that requires a lot of management by a lot of very well-trained people.
That's right. A lot of regulation, a lot of standards, and that I think people in the industry will tell you that that's what's going on. That there is an attentiveness out there. Just because it's absolutely mandated, it's absolutely necessary.
Right. And again, we'll get to it, but yeah, if people aren't actively managing it, let me rephrase that. Nuclear energy is not something you can just let lie, right? It's actively managed. You cannot ignore it. You can't even really just turn it off. That requires a lot of work, So we're going to get into a little bit of all of this. But just as a reminder, we're not a science podcast necessarily, although I would argue geography is a science, but we're not a physics or a energy science podcast. So
we lean more on the social science side of things.
The social science. So what we're going to be talking about today is going to lean heavily into that. And we very well might get things wrong, and that's fine. I'm okay admitting that there's probably going to be some nuclear scientist who listens to this at one point and says, nope,
it's not entirely correct.
Or
at all correct. But hopefully we're able to represent fairly well what's going on, and that's what we aim to do is to bring the general research that we've done and put it into some perspective to folks who haven't done that kind of research.
Right. And so with that, we're going to dive into sort of the first sort of point I want to bring up. And this is before we get into the history of it all, which we're going to cover. But I think broadly, we need to talk a little bit about the differences between nuclear fission and nuclear fusion. And hopefully you heard the differences in there, but one is spelled Fission, the other one Fusion. So they are two vastly different concepts.
Can you break it down for us?
A little bit. So this might be where the first nuclear scientist is like, excuse me, but I'm going to try because I've done a little bit of reading about this. So broadly, to start with, what we consider nuclear power, nuclear energy, or nuclear bombs today is what we would consider to be nuclear fission. If you hear anybody talk about nuclear fusion, and you think about that as in like the aspect of two things fusing together, which we'll get to in a bit why it's called that. That is a technology that has yet to really be developed. Has been sort of under researched for decades now. It is often held up as this idea of unlimited energy. That's how unlimited energy can be gained, is by nuclear fusion. And if you look at any sun, any star, right? The process that sun or star or whatever is doing is fusion, right? It's these elements that are fusing together to create a new element.
But that's more aspirational as far as we're concerned.
More
here on planet
aspirational.
Earth.
I mean, I don't know. To be honest, I'm not sure where the technology lies today. There might be. I mean, we might be pretty close. I just have no idea. I know
in terms of what's out there and functioning.
Yeah, I mean, we know that it can exist, right? Because we can look at our, as I'm looking at the sky right now, we can see the sun right there. That's fusion, right?
But in terms of planet Earth,
being able to replicate, to be able to draw power from that, I don't know. I don't know if it's possible. I don't know if it's feasible. I know that they are looking at it and they're researching it. I think every few years you typically see an article that pops up that says, such and such, country or lab or whatever, has demonstrated fusion, some, blah, blah, blah.
But anything that we've heard about that's happened, anything that's history is not that.
Right. And I think it goes to the point, like, even if a country or lab is able to make some sort of micro fusion thing, a big part of any sort of energy, or really anything that's going to be mass produced in some fashion, which energy is, has to be replicable, right? Has to be replicable, containable, harnessable, and, more to the point of our economic engine, profitable. Right. So if you have all those things and it's not profitable, then the technology is kind of dead. So, or at least that iteration of it. So, that's what nuclear fusion is, right? So just think of it as like, you're taking two elements, you're fusing them together. As they fuse, they give off a certain amount of energy, and that energy is then harnessed for whatever. Like, that's the idea behind nuclear fusion as a power technology. Nuclear fission,
which is what we're focusing
on. That's entirely, that'll probably be the last we talk about nuclear fusion, at least in any sort of broad scope. Nuclear fission is the opposite, right? It's the pulling apart of elements to create that, again, a same energy. But this one, if you think of fusion as just combining things, two elements together, you can see how that would almost be infinite, right? You can always sort of combine. This guy could be way off. There's probably some nuclear scientists like facepalm. But I think if you look at nuclear fission, you're breaking things apart, and that's why it's not quite as infinite, though it is. There's vast quantity. You can get vast quantities of energy from it, and I just think that's an important sort of thing to bring up, because the two often get conflated. We do not have any nuclear fusion plants, and I'm not sure how that technology would work, or if it would be safer, or anything like that. I've heard internet armchair experts theorize that it would be safer.
But anything that's generating energy right now is fission.
Is fission in terms of nuclear, right? Obviously, yeah, right. Coal power plant is
right. But in talking about nuclear power,
yeah, right? Yeah. So with that, I want to kind of launch a little bit into the history behind nuclear energy, because it's vast, it's deep. I don't want to spend. I think this is easily something that could spin into multiple hours. So we'll try and hit on the main topics, without dragging this on too much.
But some context is important here.
Some context is definitely very important. So if we go back to the mid 1930s, or I should say the late 1930s, is really when the very first sort of discovery of nuclear fission occurred. And it occurred after about 4 decades of work in nuclear physics, basically taking these atoms and trying to pull them apart and be able to do something with them. And they sort of finally achieved it in 1938, which is kind of an interesting year for that to happen, because
if we're thinking about a global context right now, this is in the context of a world war.
Right. Yeah. So this is when World War II, this was before the U.S. had joined World War II, but it was still very much within the context of this being a global phenomenon. And nuclear will obviously have a big hand in World War II, as we will talk about in a few.
A lot of people's imagination of this goes to that time, probably.
Right. Yeah. And so just looking at the history, again, going back, if we think about nuclear as a concept, there's two very distinct ways to think about it historically, and even today. And one is the potential around energy, right? Powering our homes, powering our businesses, powering everything. The other, and perhaps maybe that's more well-known even to today, is the weaponized version of it, right? You drop a nuclear bomb, as happened in Nagasaki, as happened in Hiroshima, and it causes unbelievable amounts of destruction. And that is primarily why nuclear, for the latter, was primarily why nuclear fission was researched.
That was the initial impetus behind it.
That was the initial impetus, right? The energy aspect of it was almost, I don't think it was an afterthought necessarily. I think broadly, I think any good scientist that starts looking at something is not necessarily trying to think of an end goal or an end product in mind. They're just trying to answer a question.
But if we're thinking about the way things are funded,
exactly,
and why governments might be interested in pushing this at a particular time in 1938, the answer is maybe different than why scientists are interested in looking at something.
Right. And so that leads us. So if your nuclear is being funded primarily with an aim in mind, which it was in this case, defense, which is a nice way of saying
it's a loaded term.
Yeah, it's a nice way of saying we're going to build a big bomb that will scare everybody else into whatever
acquiescing.
We have to jump to something else called the Manhattan Project.
Okay.
And Hunter, do you know anything about the Manhattan Project?
When I think of the Manhattan Project, I think of J. Robert Oppenheimer.
Oppenheimer. That's a key name. So the Manhattan Project was a research and development project based in the US that was designed and funded to develop the first nuclear bomb. And it was primarily led by a guy named Oppenheimer, who has a very famous, well, he is quoted as having a very famous quote. The quote actually comes from the Bhagavad Gita, which is a Indian sort of religious text. But it's something like, I have it in my notes here. Do I have it in my notes? Yes. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. And the reason why he said this pretty soon after they had their very first nuclear bomb test that went off. And he had said this because of the sheer amount of destruction that it caused, which was not actually foreseen.
So he's starting to realize what the technology he's been involved in developing is leading to.
Yeah. So there's some fun context here around the Manhattan Project. When the scientists, again, according to my readings, when the scientists were originally studying nuclear energy and specifically nuclear bombs, they got to the point where it was time to test an actual nuclear bomb. And from what I read, there was some pretty differing opinions on what would happen. And I'm not sure where Oppenheimer falls on this spectrum, but from what I could tell, scientists ranged from, well, it's not going to work at all. And basically it'll be a dud because whatever, it just won't work that way. Or two, there were some scientists that theorized that
we would destroy the world.
You would destroy the world. There's no stopping it. It would create a catalysm for where it would just keep constantly splitting atoms and blowing up and
catalyze just a chain reaction.
And so it's funny to think about this at this moment in time. And this Manhattan Project was 1942 ish. Well, I guess the Manhattan Project was technically a project from 1942 to 1946. Obviously, the nuclear bombs happened before that. But it's funny to think about the scientists during this time in the 1940s. There being some who were knowingly pushed this button, thinking that we could just, the entire world could just blow up now and could just be an ever expansive sort of, bomb that would just envelop everything and destroy everything.
It was all theoretical at this point because it hadn't been done. So people are speculating that this could be cataclysmic.
Yeah. So as it turns out, it sort of hit that middle ground where it wasn't the all-encompassing, end of days sort of, bomb, but it wasn't a dud either, right? It was actually a very, 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 very big bomb that was at the time very horrific, right? Nobody had ever seen anything at that scale before. And then we had bombs, obviously, but they were bombs that you could conceptualize almost within like, you're standing, 100 feet away and you see a bomb go off.
This is an
right?
order of magnitude that's
magnitude, yeah.
Far exceeds what had been already devised.
Yeah. And now it's not to go too far ahead into the future because I still want to talk a little bit more about the history. But if you, there's actually a website about this. Shoot, I wish I knew what it was off the top of my head, but there's a website that lets you see the circumference of a bomb's radius, like how big of an impact it's going to have. And so if you go onto that website, you can select the original sort of atom bomb and you can use it over any Google Maps area, right? So you can go over, we're here in Portland, you can go over city of Portland, you can look at it.
Allows people to get more
visualize how big that, how much destruction is going to be caused. And if you look at that very first nuclear bomb, it's going to take a, sort of a 2 or 3 square mile area. I don't know. Maybe it's a single square mile. I don't know. But it's like something relatively small. And you do like the latest nuclear bomb that the U.S. has developed, and it's like the entire city of Portland is wiped out. So it's the nuclear bombs we're talking about today are not the same nuclear bombs back then, right? So the bombs that we dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima are minuscule to what sort of gets tossed around and threatened.
Which is a pretty horrific thought.
Very horrific, right? Yeah. So it's so all that's to say is the history of nuclear is rooted in something that's not been a benefit to society, I would say. However, and actually, before we get into it, because there's a lot to talk about in the history, but wouldn't you know, it's already time to do some ads.
Is that right?
Yeah, I know. It goes by so fast. So we're going to run some ads.
Dramatic pause,
and then we're going to come back and talk a little bit more about nuclear energy. We're going to sort of move on from nuclear bombs at this point.
Okay, very good.
All right, here we go. Welcome back. We are here talking about nuclear. Well, we've been talking about nuclear bombs, which is maybe not the lightest and brightest subject, but we're gonna move on to
shift gears. Yeah, another aspect of this technology.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about nuclear energy. So nuclear energy was derived from the weaponized version of this, as basically people realizing that all these bombs are emitting a lot of energy, and if there's a way for us to harness that, then it could go to the benefit of a lot of people. And so if we go all the way back to, let's say, to June 27th, 1954, actually it's before that. Well, no, let's stick on that date. So in June 27th, 1954, the Obninsk nuclear power plant in the Soviet Republic became the world's first nuclear power plant to generate electricity for a power grid. And so at that time, it produced about 5 megawatts of electric power, which is not that much power. If we look at, I think the largest nuclear power plant in the U.S. today produces about 1,500. So they've gotten a lot better.
Okay.
But what's interesting here, not to go back to sort of the militarized aspect of it, but that was the first power plant or I guess a reactor to plug into a national grid to actually provide electricity. That wasn't the first reactor general. The first reactor came from the U.S.
Okay.
And that came just about 6 months before that, in January of 1954. However, that was to power a nuclear submarine. And so it was called the USS Nautilus. It launched in January of 1954. And I think what's most interesting here is the difference in ideology behind sort of what this technology could enable first and foremost. And at this point, the bombs were already sort of old news, right? This is 1954. The bombs are now 10-ish years old, maybe a little bit less than that. The U.S. continues to prioritize defense and sort of its military, whereas the USSR, Soviet Republic, that's not to say they weren't working on their own defense stuff.
For sure.
But they're
looking at energy.
They're looking at energy production first and foremost. How can they tap into their grid and be able to provide electricity? And I just think it's an interesting thing that you wouldn't naturally have assumed. Maybe you would have assumed it about the US, but maybe you would have assumed the same about Soviet Republic or Soviet Union. Yeah. So
they're already trying to harness this into a way that can be translated into a deliverable form of electricity, of energy.
Yeah, which I guess the U.S. was doing as well, right? They were just looking to power their military with it. I mean, the USS Nautilus wasn't a nuclear missile firing; it was just nuclear power.
It was propulsion. Yep.
And the way those things work is that they're basically have an endless amount of power. They can basically sit underwater forever. I think they do have to come up, every once in a while, but there's nothing. Nuclear, the way the technology works, to my understanding, is that it takes a very, very, very long time to exhaust your supply of fuel, which is uranium. And so if you can put that, microsize it into a submarine, then that submarine basically can go on forever. Or a long, long time.
Autonomous from having to be part of a grid or be refueled or anything. Mm-hmm. And I suppose from a military standpoint, there's some strategic benefits.
Right. So... But let's go back in time just a little bit longer. I wanted to address that. So, while the Soviet Republic was the first one to tap into a grid, that was sort of their priority, getting energy. Again, they did have militaristic priorities around it as well. I'm not taking away from that. And the U.S. had energy priorities as well, and we'll talk about that right now. Which is in 1951, at an experimental station near Arco, Idaho. They did develop a nuclear reactor that produced about 100 kilowatts. So less than 1% of the Soviet Union's first power plant that plugged into their grid. And so there was this concept in the U.S. to develop this technology for peaceful means as well, right? They weren't ignoring that,
right?
And that was largely pushed by the president at the time, who was Dwight Eisenhower.
Who we've talked about on the show in a previous episode.
We've already talked about him on the previous show. It turns out Dwight Eisenhower was a pretty impactful president, all things considered. And at least in my research, I don't know if he necessarily gets talked about enough, but I would say he's had a pretty heavy hand in a lot of what our country looks like today.
In terms of transportation, in terms of energy creation, in terms of the military.
Yeah. So I think it's just worth calling out very impactful president in a way that I think some presidents get a little bit more undue recognition. I'm not a Dwight Eisenhower stan. I think he's done a lot of things good, and I think he's done a lot of things bad. But I think overall he just hasn't been talked about enough, and we're here rectifying that.
A big impact is what we're talking about.
Very impactful. Very impactful. So going back to Dwight, so he sort of launched the idea around, or sort of made it a pivotal part of his presidency around, for lack of a better word, democratizing nuclear energy. And so he gave this very impactful speech at the United Nations called Atoms for Peace. And the Atoms for Peace speech was basically wrapped around this idea that nuclear energy should be used for peaceful expansion of power energy, like in energy creation, and that the United States would help fund programs to bring nuclear energy to the world.
So trying to change the narrative, people have this association with nuclear energy as being used in a wartime situation. Mm-hmm. And trying to switch that narrative so people can think, all right, this can be used for something else and something that we're going to associate with peace.
Right. Kind of, right? But there was still kind of a wartime aspect to this.
Right. Well, this is the Cold War at this
point.
Yeah.
And at that time, the U.S. was very focused on the idea of containment. Do you know what containment is?
Well, it's the idea of not letting a particular ideology, in this case, communism, spread any further.
Exactly. So this technology, this funding, this speech even was a way to start luring countries into the influential sphere of the United States in order to prevent them from leaning into communism, into leaning on the Soviet Union, to anything that sort of could have been diametrically opposed to the United States, right?
Yeah, when we think of the Cold War, we think in terms of races, and we think of an arms race, or we're thinking of an energy race, and the idea is to get further ahead of this other superpower in order to sway the international community in the direction and the ideology that you're promoting.
Right. And so there was two countries that were the very first two countries that basically received help and funding in nuclear power reactors through this program. And I'm curious if you know what they are, or if you can guess what they are.
I'm going to guess, and I don't know, so this
Okay.
is a straight up guess. I'm going to guess Japan and France.
No, you would be incorrect, but we will talk about
Okay.
Japan and
All
France in a little bit because they have a huge part of this
Because I'm
history.
yeah.
So I think once I tell you them, you're not going to be surprised. So the first one is Israel,
Okay.
and the second one is Pakistan.
Interesting.
And if you think about these two countries, today they're both nuclear powered and nuclear armed countries. And they both have had a undue, I would say, maybe Pakistan more than Israel, but undue amount of influence within the American U.S. Sort of geopolitical sphere.
Right. In terms of geopolitics and foreign aid, this kind of thing.
Right.
It's certainly in the case of Israel. I can see that.
Yeah. And so these two sort of started that that process. And I'm not really sure, aside from the impetus of Israel always being sort of intrinsically linked to sort of Western powers just by the nature of how it came to be in its modern state. I'm not really sure why Pakistan was chosen at the time. I didn't delve too deeply into the reasons behind why those two countries were chosen. Again, I think if I were to guess, I would say Pakistan probably because it's fairly close to the Soviet Union, made for a good sort of buffer. You want to start, those would probably be the states that you want to, for lack of a better term, acquire into your influence before the Soviet Republic, similar to what they would, I'm assuming, tried to do with Cuba and did do with Cuba.
Right.
Israel, I'm assuming just because the fact that it was a Western sort of propped up sort of state in the beginning, and they wanted to ensure that it existed, right? And there was a lot of and we're going to get more into Israel later because again they come back into play quite a bit, but I'm assuming that's sort of why they were one of the first countries.
Okay.
So this all led into the piece of legislation called the Atomic Energy Act of 1954. And this was a pivotal moment for nuclear power for a single reason. And it was that it allowed for private companies to have access to nuclear information so that they could build privatized nuclear power plants. So prior to that, all the information, even just the basic information behind nuclear energy and how it worked and all that was classified. So private companies couldn't build their own nuclear power plant. They couldn't conceive of it. They all had to be run through the government, which in a capitalist society is intrinsically limiting, right?
Well, there's a history, a more recent history even of technologies that emerged from the military being used beyond the military. And I'm thinking of GPS, I'm thinking of the internet, I'm thinking about things that were pioneered in the context of the military and then become more part of the capitalist system.
Right, which makes sense, right? The government often foots the bill for that initial research that no for-profit company certainly would necessarily put that much effort and time into when there was very little or almost no possibility of returning a profit, right? And none of this was determined, right? The internet, GPS, and nuclear energy, none of that had an obvious, profitability payment sort of aspect to it when it was first starting. So it makes sense. Nuclear energy also happens to be a very destructive. So I can also see that aspect of like, okay, we know it's very powerful. We know we can do power plants. We know we can do all this stuff, but it's also very, 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 very dangerous. And so letting that out to private companies is, I think, inherently going to be dangerous.
Well, I suppose the internet is dangerous in a different way, but
oh boy.
I guess the point also is that the government then, that's a good point. The government then allows private industry to take it from there to a certain degree and to start the investment.
And then the other half of this piece of legislation that was really key to enabling that was that it allowed for, or it removed all restrictions around being able to patent nuclear technologies. So prior to that, you wouldn't have been able to patent anything that had to do anything to do with nuclear energy here in the United States. Obviously, it's not speaking for other countries. Right. But a lot of the initial investment at that time was either in the Soviet Union or the United States. So that had a big impact on it. So with that, at that point, the amount of nuclear power plants started to grow. So I have a fun stat here. So from the early 1960s, or I guess in the early 1960s, the amount of nuclear power plants that existed produced about 1 gigawatt of energy to the grid. And so just to contextualize that number a little bit, 1 gigawatt is roughly equated to about 750,000 homes and businesses.
For how long?
Per year.
Okay.
Right? So it's
okay.
1 gigawatt per year. Yeah.
I got you.
So, yeah, 1 gigawatt per year is about how much it's spitting out.
So how many did we have at that time in the 1960s? One
1 gigawatt in the early 1960s.
No, but how many different like power plants or reactors?
I don't know. I didn't look at exactly because it gets kind of hard because a lot of power plants can range from anywhere from so it starts how many you're counting, right? From anywhere from 100 megawatts to 1,500 megawatts, that kind of thing. And there's even ones that are even smaller. There's like micro power plants. So, all that's to say is 20 years later, the amount of power generated is now 100 gigawatts. And so that equates to about 75 million homes and businesses that are powered yearly by nuclear power. So that's that might not seem like a huge jump over 20 years. 20 years is a long time. But in terms of energy production, energy processes, energy creation, especially given it's a brand new technology, that's like light speed.
Well, I mean, if you think about that, 30 or 40 years before that, it was zero. So that's actually a fairly significant number.
Right. And at this time, nuclear energy was really seen, and there's some really fun advertisements out there, but it was really seen as this wonder technology that was like the future of, the world is nuclear. The future,
industry ads from the 50s and 60s are something to behold. That's for sure.
Okay. So with that, let's dive into, you know what? I kind of want to do another quick ad break because this next section is, I think, going to take us through.
Okay. Well, let's do that. And then we'll come back and find out more about where this is all heading.
Yeah. Which is, we're going back to Israel.
Okay.
Here we go. Let's do some ads. So hopefully you bought some ads. You definitely listened to some ads. Well, I think you can actually fast forward.
Hopefully you're still here.
But you're still here, and that's the important part. So we left you off at sort of the expansion of nuclear power during the middle part of the 20th century, 1900s. Now we're going to head into sort of what maybe was a big catalyst for even more expansion, and that is something called the 1970s oil crisis. Hunter, do you know what that is?
Well, yeah, it was a period of time when the United States was in conflict with, Israel was in conflict with some of its neighbors in Southwest Asia, and the United States, a major supporter of Israel, became tangentially involved in that through funding Israel. And then the number of oil-producing countries started to retaliate by raising the price of oil, which sends oil-dependent countries like the United States into a crisis.
Right. Correct. Yeah. So so essentially, so let's go back to what you sort of hinted on there, was that the way that the 1970s oil crisis happened was through basically I think it was a 19-day war. Yeah, I have it here in my notes. 19-day war that's commonly referred to, at least here in the West, as the Yom Kippur War. I think if you were asked somebody in Southwest Asia, in the Arab states, they would call it the Ramadan War because they happened basically in the same time. It was a war that it was basically Israel versus, actually I have a list here. It was Israel versus a coalition of Arab states led by Egypt and Syria, but also had expeditionary sort of troops supplied by Saudi Arabia, Algeria, Jordan, Iraq, Libya, Kuwait, Tunisia, Morocco, Sudan, and Cuba.
Okay.
And so there was all those countries that were basically against Israel. And it was primarily driven by the fact that Israel, due to a variety of conflicts over the middle of the 1900s,
there's a series of conflicts.
Yeah, this was the fourth one. This was
right, exactly.
And they had control of the Golan Heights and the Sinai Peninsula.
That's right.
And so Sinai Peninsula is I think more obvious than the Golan Heights, just geographically, is owned by Israel, or sorry, was owned by Israel during this time, owned by Egypt, historically has been Egyptian. And so that's sort of the impetus for why Egypt and Syria attacked, because each one of them wanted their territories back. And the rest of them sort of just didn't really like Israel for a lot of geopolitical reasons we're just not going to get into.
Right. That would be a whole nother episode.
But what I kind of wanted to get at through this really brief discussion is just how much Israel destroyed these other countries. Even though it was by itself, it was supported by the U.S. and some Western European countries. The Arab states also had their benefactors, right? Soviet Union, for example, was supporting
So this is all Cold War context.
Very Cold War context. But Israel, during this 19-day conflict, this 19-day war, lost somewhere around 2,800 soldiers with about 8,800 injured. Meanwhile, the Arab coalition lost 19,000 soldiers with an additional 35,000 wounded.
In a short period of time.
Very short period of time. And again, I just think it's interesting that Cuba was involved at all, because it's so far out of their sphere.
It just shows the coalition of a geopolitical world, right? And this is the globalized world where what happens in one place,
right,
starts to impact what happens in other places, and these are how alliances are formed. And
right, so Cuba lost about 180 troops during this war. And I think if you actually look at, not to get too deep into this, but if you look at Cuba and their involvement, I think they serve mostly as a direct corollary for Soviet Union having troops there, right?
Right.
Because Cuba at the time was very much tied to Soviet Union. So
the United States didn't have diplomatic relations with Cuba. There was a trade embargo. Mm-hmm. This adds up.
Exactly. So this Arab coalition, gets roundly defeated, and they continue. They blame Israel, for everything that their original conflict was about, and they also blame the U.S. primarily, and then also some of the U.S.'s allies that helped to support Israel during this time. And going back to your point, they basically turned off the faucet to oil for the Western world. I mean, what they did was they jacked up a lot of the prices. And so gasoline became very scarce in the U.S. and Europe.
And very expensive,
right? And so, my mom would tell me, she was born in 1963. She will tell me that she recalls being 12 or something, or some age like that, and just like sort of sitting in like a long line of cars.
You could only buy gasoline based on things like the last digit of your license plate. And anybody who lived through it remembers. And if you don't, there's all kinds of historic images.
Oh yeah. There's like so many very
sold out of
photos.
gas today. Mm-hmm. And in response, and this is maybe another episode as well, production of the type of car started to change in the United States. And there was a turn towards trying to create, vehicles that were much more, consumed much more fuel efficient, in other words.
Yeah, there are cars that were developed in like 1978, whatever, that got better gas mileage than most cars do today.
So this is a personal story. I became of driving age in the 1980s, mm-hmm. and I purchased a used vehicle from a family in my neighborhood, and it was a 79 Vet. Mm-hmm. It was a Chevette in my case, but it was very fuel efficient, and it was the kind of vehicle I think had been created in response. It was years later, but it had been created in response to the energy crisis, the oil situation that you're describing.
Right, which I think was maybe even logical, because I think at that point people realized, well, they can do this again, and then
we've been talking about diminishing our dependence on what's called foreign oil ever since.
Right.
And the idea is, if you have this kind of dependency on a key resource that, of course, the United States produces oil as well, but if you're dependent on other countries from delivering a large percentage of that, then you are losing some of your independence in some way. And so to be able to fight against that, we need to have more fuel efficiency.
Right. And so I think that gets basically where I was heading, was that, in response to this oil crisis, a number of countries decided that they really needed to focus on their own independence. And at this time, oil was also being used to provide a lot of electricity, right? There was oil power plants. So they wanted to focus on the independence of their own electrical grid. And it just so happens that nuclear energy happens to be a pretty good way of doing this. And so we'll talk a little bit more about how this intersects with today's situation. But going back to the 1970s and 80s, the 1973 oil crisis had a significant impact on countries, but in particular two, which you had already brought up earlier, which is France and Japan.
Okay.
And so France and Japan, prior to this, had historically relied pretty heavily on oil and oil power plants to drive a lot of their electricity. And so, whereas the U.S. had a lot of coal, right? We have a lot of coal in this country, and I think England as well. So they were not only hit at the gas stations, the gas pumps for the transportation, but they were also hit on their grid. So they had an energy crisis on their hands, right?
And then for heating, perhaps as well.
For heating as well,
degree.
right? Yeah. In fact, a lot of places back then had oil heating, right? Like I used to live in a house here in Portland that had a big old oil tank and was still oil heated.
Pretty common around here. Yeah. Many of them have been decommissioned, but if you go back to the late 1800s, early 1900s, that was pretty standard, I think.
Right. And so these two countries, in an effort to sort of become more independent, really focused on developing nuclear power, and they largely succeeded, right? So if we look at France as an example, in particular, they would construct 25 nuclear power plants over the next 15 years. And then now, as of 2019, I think it's fluctuated a little bit, but as of 2019, somewhere around 70% of all of French electricity was generated by nuclear power. That is the highest percentage of any country in the world. I
was going to guess that must be among the highest.
Yeah.
And indeed it is. It's the top.
It is. And if you, it plays a lot into some of the current stressors within the European Union today, right? Mm-hmm. It's especially around energy. You basically have today now, given it's a post-Brexit European Union, you basically have the two big countries, right? Which is France and Germany.
That's right.
And they are, or at least things are changing rapidly these days. And we'll talk about it in a little bit, but they have been sort of diametrically opposed or diametrically on opposite sides of nuclear. So
as a source of energy.
As a source of energy. Yeah. Right. Yeah. We're not talking about weapons anymore. Right. Just as energy production. So France has been very pro-nuclear. They've invested a lot into it. They have a lot of nuclear power plants. Germany has been winding its nuclear power down. It's been decommissioning its power plants and not really planning for any more. And I think that's really interesting, given that these two countries are close allies. They're right next to each other. And I think it goes to show maybe some intrinsic differences back in that 1970s from what Germany was being powered with.
Well, it also,
and granted, half of Germany at that point was still Soviet, Union, right?
Right.
So that plays into this.
Well, it illustrates that even within the context of the European Union today, there's quite a bit of autonomy and decision making that happens within each of the member states.
Right. It does, yeah. And I have this really quick fact to throw out here, because we're going to talk about this in a second. But just given that France is so heavily dependent on nuclear energy, it's just worth calling out that they have never had a major nuclear incident. So we're going to talk about some nuclear,
and that helps keep it a popular form of energy there as well, because in their own national experience, there haven't been any disasters, and so it's been dependable.
Right. So with that, let's get into our final section of today's part one of this episode. Let's get into some of the opposition behind nuclear power, where it comes from, and then talk about some of the disasters.
Okay.
So if I were to ask you what's the most talked about reason for the opposition to nuclear power today, what would you
I would say that it's the potential for a disaster, which would, a meltdown of a reactor or something like that, which would cause widespread, death, injury, and contamination, and would completely transform natural environments. I think in my mind, that would be my answer.
See, I would actually have thought that originally, but in a lot of my research, the highest reason for people being opposed to it was nuclear waste.
Okay, well that would have been number 2 on my list.
So I think they're 1 and 2, no matter how you cut it. So I think it's worth talking about nuclear waste just a little bit, because I think it's definitely one of those things that was there's been a lot of misinformation about it. It's been, for a lot of different industries, rightfully tried to make it a boogeyman. We obviously talked a little bit about The Simpsons earlier. Not that there was necessarily anything intentional or malicious behind it, but I think it...
Well, when they try to spoof a lot of things, but you have these images of open canisters of this is green ooze in liquid form that is causing three-eyed fish to swim around in the river.
Right. And so I think it's worth highlighting. Okay, let's talk a little bit about nuclear waste. So essentially, radioactive waste generated by nuclear power plants can be roughly broken down into 3 categories, right? So you have your low-level waste, which emits about 1% of the total radioactivity of nuclear waste. So it's still it's not emitting no radioactivity, but it's not the kind where if you walk into a room with it and you walk out, you're now turning into a puddle of a human being.
Right.
Then you have your intermediate level waste, and this emits about 4% of the total radioactivity. And then you have your high level waste, and this is the waste that is really, really dangerous. And it emits 95% of the total radioactivity, and is, for all intents and purposes, it is very bad, highly dangerous for human beings and basically all life to be interacted with.
And I think one of the statistics I have from research based on what's happening in the United States is about 90% of this waste by volume is the low level. Yes. So that the majority of the waste is of that category.
Right. So if we look at the amount generated, high level waste makes up an incredibly small percentage of all nuclear waste. Intermediate level waste only makes up about 7% of the total nuclear waste. So again, that's the one that emits about 4% of the total radioactivity. When we're talking about having to store a large quantity, and we'll get to what large quantity means in a minute, when we're talking about storing a large quantity of waste, we are talking about low-level waste. So again, this is stuff that is really not that radioactive. It's not great, but it's not unbelievably, horrifyingly death-inducing.
It's in a solid state.
It's in a solid state, yeah.
Right. Not that makes it good or anything, but I think a lot of people in our popular imagination that it's this liquid or something like that,
it's green,
which
it's glowing,
is harder
it's
to
flowing,
contain.
Yeah.
Right. So again, not that means that it's not potentially a problem, but maybe not the image that people have in their head.
Well, and then also I think a lot of people think that, okay, well, you're creating all this waste and it doesn't matter how radioactive it's going to be, but it's going to take, hundreds of thousands of years, sitting inside a mountain. How much can we really store of that, right? And I have 2 points to make on that. So first is that the low-level waste, which is the kind of waste that can get treated, which it does, it will generally decay into harmless materials in about 3 decades. So about 30 years, the relatively low radioactivity is already gone.
Okay.
So you no longer have to worry about it. You can move it on out and you can put other stuff in its place. But just to the point of the amount of nuclear waste, I think there's this idea, and maybe this is generated by, things like The Simpsons, where, you sort of see the nuclear power plant and then like a pipe out of it and sort of flowing like a bunch of green goo into the lake. And now there's a 3-headed fish and all that kind of stuff. Nuclear power plants do not actually generate all that much waste. And this was a really fun statistic that I found that really contextualizes it for those of us in the United States. But it's the amount of nuclear waste that's been generated in the United States since the 1960s could all fit within a standard American football field, which is 100 yards by, I don't know, probably like 40 yards or something like that.
Or less.
With a depth of about 30 feet. Now, that's not a small amount of waste.
It's not insignificant, but it's probably not what people are thinking.
But it's not what people are thinking, right? I think there's this popular idea of like, well, we're having to hollow out entire mountains.
Right, because you hear about Yucca Mountain.
Right.
This was a proposal to turn, this one area in Nevada into the area where all the nuclear waste in the United States would go. And the idea was that you needed an entire mountain to store all this stuff.
Right. So I guess all that's to say is that nuclear waste is, it's more of a boogeyman than anything else. That's not to say there aren't issues
Well,
around
there's
it.
certainly some real issues,
Yeah.
but the scale of the issue might not be what people are thinking.
Right. And so with that, let's get into our disasters.
Okay.
So probably to Hunter's point, another big reason for people's dislike of nuclear energy is behind some very prominent nuclear disasters. And I would say the first one that anybody will talk about is Chernobyl.
Right.
And so Chernobyl,
1986.
1986, the year I was born.
Wow.
Year I was born, I believe the same month that I was born, actually.
That was in high
Which I think was
school
also the
at
first,
that time,
was
but
the month that...
I remember hearing about this incident in high school, but
I think that was the same month that the Challenger exploded, too.
Wow.
Yeah, it was an inauspicious time for me to come into this world. Anyway, so Chernobyl was a Soviet nuclear power plant in Ukraine. And so I guess, like, we don't necessarily need to get into each one of these in too great of detail, but there is actually a really good show from HBO that actually, from what I've been told, did a really good job of. I mean, I've seen it. It
This
was really
is
good.
the fictionalized account.
It's fictionalized.
Right?
Well, but it's historical fiction.
Right, historical
So they
fiction,
definitely
right.
drew from historical aspects of it. But I think if you look at that show, you can get a very good idea of sort of what it was kind of like and sort of what the systems in place, sort of how they failed. But I just kind of want to call it out because it's spread a lot of radiation throughout Europe. And so that's led to a lot of people in Europe broadly. And I think a large part of people in Germany turning against nuclear energy.
Right, because those are the people who are most directly affected. And, of course, there's the city of Pripyat, which was a small town of mostly apparently families that had to be evacuated and is still unviable. And so people have that. And I think that some people might have these images from Pripyat in their mind. There's a famous series of photos that show part of an amusement park, which in fact apparently was 5 days from opening, had never actually opened. And I remember one with some bumper cars, and they're flipped over, and the natural environment is starting to take it back. And this has become an image that I think has been very cautionary for people thinking about this type of energy creation in general.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, and so if so, there's a scale of nuclear disasters that has been created. So it's the International Nuclear Event Scale. And so Chernobyl is rated a level 7, which is the highest rating. So it's, it's a major disaster. It's obviously, it went into meltdown.
Yeah. One of the nuclear reactor 4 went into a meltdown. They've had to, the way they contained it apparently was with a steel and concrete sarcophagus they placed over it. And I think more recently they're building something to place on top of that.
Yeah. So the next major disaster, if we can move on just to keep this humming, is
Fukushima.
Fukushima
Daiichi, I think, is the name of the plant in particular.
Yeah, it's so in 2011 there was a major earthquake.
Daiichi,
that occurred that caused, I'm not sure the specifics, but caused some sort of internal issues where the reactors were no longer able to be cooled, which then forced it to go into meltdown. And just like with Chernobyl, it was also a level 7 major event. It's actually, there's only 2 level 7 events. It's Chernobyl and Fukushima. But this one happened much closer to us in terms of time, much more recent history.
This was 2011.
2011, yeah. So that's like, I mean, Facebook was around at that time. Instagram was around at that time. There's a lot of these photos that sort of float around from people who, well, for one, the entire area was demolished because of the earthquake. It was a major earthquake.
Right. And so it was a tsunami related to that as well.
Yeah.
And I think that was part of what caused the breakdown in the technologies that cooled, and led to the failure.
Yeah. And so these, both of these power plants occurred in places that historically had a lot of nuclear power generation. So Chernobyl's in Ukraine, still does have a lot of nuclear power generation today. We'll talk a little bit more about that. In Japan, since 2011 has turned away from nuclear power generation until recently for what we'll talk about next episode.
Okay.
But just getting to a couple more disasters. So here at home, in the U.S., this was actually probably the first major nuclear sort of incident on a global scale, which was 3 Mile Island.
1979.
1979. So this was only a level 5 incident. So it didn't go into full meltdown, but it got pretty close, and it was pretty scary for a lot of people who lived in Pennsylvania. And so that sort of marks the turning point for nuclear in the U.S. That's sort of the point where people were like, "Oh, this is
dangerous.
This is a little dangerous."
That's
right?
what people are thinking.
And we'll talk about the actual danger of that again in a second. But moving just on from 3 Mile Island, we now have another incident that was very recent, this year even, and that is the Zaporizhia nuclear power station, again in Ukraine. And the reason why I want to highlight this one is because, and I have a quote here, is because, quote, it's because it's wrapped up in the war in Ukraine, right? There was an active war zone. And the quote is, the situation in Ukraine is unprecedented. It is the first time a military conflict has occurred amid the nuclear facilities of a large established nuclear power plant. So that had never really happened before. And now it's a consideration for building out nuclear facilities, right? Is this an area that is going to have conflict? And now you have to worry about what shelling, for example, is going to do to your being able to contain.
It brings up the idea of sabotage.
Right.
And so that this is a concern that I think there's been that concern, but this is evidence that now there's a precedent for this having actually occurred.
Right. And I believe it's still not operational today. I'm not sure what the current state of it is. I think they're actively working on it, but it's no longer in danger zone. They managed to contain it. So it hasn't been given, as far as I could tell, it hasn't been given a level rating. That might be coming still. I would be surprised if it was even a level 5 at this point. Because I think based on what I could read, 3 Mile Island got closer to.
Okay.
Yeah, I think. Yeah. And so from that, before we get to the end of today's episode, I just kind of want to talk about this aspect of the total amount of deaths caused by energy production. Because I think it's a very interesting fact. And granted, we're never going to truly know exactly how many deaths are caused by each individual thing, right? There's so many variables, right? However, if we add up everything, including the people who have died directly from cancer linked to nuclear, now
that has been documented. So that's the caveat.
There are fewer than 5,000 deaths globally from nuclear, which puts it at fewer deaths than wind power and far fewer than coal and oil and natural gas, which they account for. Well, I'm not sure what they account for. I assume they accounted for air pollution.
Okay.
So there's some differently abled sort of statistics being floated in there. I'm not sure how
expansive,
even they are.
Right.
Yeah. But I still thought it was interesting just to see that, again, we don't know the full extent of how many people caught cancer 20, 30 years later from some incident that just wasn't ever linked to a nuclear event. Right.
And, this is not an insignificant number.
Yeah.
And certainly for the people and for the families, this is significant, but again, maybe not what people might have in mind.
Right. Yeah. So I think in general, people think like, well, Chernobyl killed, 300,000 people, which it didn't. A lot of people had to move, and that was very traumatic, and it spread a lot of radiation, which probably did cause a lot of issues for a lot of different people.
For sure it did.
But the actual deaths from that were only, I think, around 2,500.
When you compare it to these other industries, like oil, for example.
Right. So it's just interesting to compare it in terms of death and just, the perceived safety of something versus the real safety, or at least in terms of how it's been shown. And so the statistics I'm getting from, which is from our world and data, I think are wildly out of sync with each other. And so I just have one more thing to bring up. And this is really quick, just because I know if I don't bring it up, people are going to talk about it in the comments. And this is molten salt reactors, thorium salt reactors.
All right. So talk to us about that.
I actually don't know that much about them. I certainly don't know what the science is behind them, but apparently it's a newer version of a nuclear power reactor that has completely negated the any sort of potential or negative side effects from a meltdown. So there's something to do with the salt that initially will immediately create some sort of containment or something like that, where basically no longer, if all of our nuclear power plants were thorium salt or molten salt reactors, we wouldn't really have to worry about it at all. And I think they also don't produce any waste.
Now, I'll just raise something that I know that, at least in the case of 3 Mile Island, in the case of Chernobyl,
they said something similar.
there's some human error.
Yeah.
Right. And so, there's the promise of a technology that this is fail proof, this is fail safe type situation, but there's always a chance that somebody could do something that make that. I'm just
I agree.
This is a critique that will be raised. So I just want to put that out.
I totally agree. I mean, this is what I've read, and the caveat here is that, again, maybe I just didn't dig deep enough into it, but from what I could tell, there hasn't actually been a proof of concept of the molten salt reactor as being an actual power plant. There's no power plant that's molten salt reactor yet. So we haven't. I think there's been some tests. I think there's been some small scale things that have maybe proven some of this theory. I don't know if it's been fully tested big scale, but if I didn't bring it up, people were going to talk about it. People were going to say, well, you guys don't know anything.
That's another thing that people need to know is in the mix here.
Yeah, exactly. So, geez, that's been a little over an hour of me just talking about the history of nuclear energy.
There's a lot to say.
There's a lot to say. We are going to wrap up our episode now. Next week, come back. We're gonna hit on sort of the current energy infrastructure of the United States and Europe. Sort of what do we have today? What do we use today? We're going to talk a little bit about Russia, natural gas, and climate change and pollution, because all this stuff is sort of tied together. We're going to talk about the worldwide energy crisis, and then we're going to launch into some fun and what if scenarios. So with that, pluggables.
All right. Well, again, my name's Hunter Shobe. And if you want to take a look at some of my work, I've written a couple books with some colleagues. I'm co-authored of this, and we've had a lot of contributions. The books are Portlandness, A Cultural Atlas, and Upper Left Cities, A Cultural Atlas of San Francisco, Portland, and Seattle.
And I'm Jeff Gibson. You can find me on my YouTube channel of the same name, What If Geography, youtube.com/whatifgeography. You can also follow me on Substack at geographybyjeff.substack.com. And again, if you didn't know, my name is spelled Geoff, so make sure you're spelling that correctly. There's a lot of fun content on there. I really enjoy writing for it, and it's sort of a fun side hobby of mine. So feel free to follow me there, and we will see you next week.
We'll see you next time. Thank you.
Bye.